Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay in Baltimore. In New York, the United Nations General Assembly has assembled. Most of the leaders of the world's governments are there making speeches. And now joining us to talk about a few of those speeches is Vijay Prashad. He's a professor of international studies at Trinity College in Northampton, Massachusetts. He's the author of The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World, and more recently, Arab Spring, Libyan Winter. And he's a regular contributor now on the Real News Network. Thanks for joining us, Vijay.
Thank you.
So you've watched some of the speeches. What's jumped out for you?
One of the important issues brought up at the UN General Assembly's opening is the question of Israel and Palestine, which is why, of course, Mr. Netanyahu's speech was looked at with some focus. What made this a little different than previous years is that this is the first major General Assembly after the change of leadership in North Africa and West Asia, which is what made Mr. Morsi's speech so significant. And of course, because of the drumbeats of war, everybody wanted to hear what the Israelis, the Americans, and of course the Iranians were going to say about Iran. Interestingly, the most fascinating speech didn't come from Mr. Ahmadinejad, who normally, is filled with a kind of bluster, but this time gave a kind of laundry list of criticisms against the history of the United States in particular, raising questions of slavery, raising questions of, police brutality, raising questions even of the 99%. But this year he was fairly subdued. The most interesting speech came from Mohamed Morsi of Egypt. And Mr. Morsi raised about 3 or 4 issues which I think are worth mentioning. One of them, of course, was the Palestine question. And in fact, he led with the question of Palestine, saying that there has been the Arab Spring, there has been a momentous change in Egypt, and he claimed the mantle of the revolution, not for himself or his political party, but said he was the first leader from Egypt to speak at the UN who had won a democratic election.
The fruits of dignity and freedom must not remain far from the Palestinian people. It is shameful that the free world would accept that a party in the international community may continue to deny the rights of a nation that looks to independence over decades, no matter what justification.
So he said that in all this, the Palestinians have been left out. So front and center for Mr. Morsi was Palestine, but very much importantly in his speech, he raised the question of a nuclear-free zone in West Asia and in fact in North Africa.
The will of the people, especially in our region, no longer tolerates the continued non-accession of any country to the nuclear non-proliferation treaty and the non-application of the safeguards regime to their nuclear facilities, especially if this is coupled with irresponsible policies or arbitrary threats.
And why this is significant is it's a way to relate the kind of garrisoning or strangulation of Iran to the fact of Israel also having nuclear weapons. That is, Israel is a kind of ambiguous nuclear power. Iran has a nuclear program that it's got, which is also not clear to the West at least, whether it's for peaceful purposes or whether it's for military purposes. But there's no question that Israel has an ambiguous nuclear kind of program. So Mr. Morsi, having said that Palestine must be front and center, came out directly and said we need to create a Middle East nuclear-free zone.
Egypt stresses the need to mobilize international efforts to hold a conference on declaring a Middle East free of nuclear weapons zone and all other weapons of mass destruction before the end of the current year 2012.
I think this is a very important thing coming from him. He's raised a question which had previously been kept at the margins. You know, a very marginal actors had talked about a nuclear-free zone in the Middle East. It's significant that he put it front and center. Mr. Morsi also waded directly into the conflict in Syria, where he spoke a little bit about the Syria contact group, which he had initiated, bringing together Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. Now, this contact group has had its problems. It was supposed to meet on the sidelines of the General Assembly, but that has been postponed because the Turkish Prime Minister, Mr. Erdogan, was not able to come to the General Assembly. People may be interested to know that there is a great deal of turmoil inside Turkey. The southwestern part of Turkey, where there's a large Kurdish population, is up in arms again, and this has compromised Turkey's very aggressive stand towards Syria, and they seem to be backing off a little bit from their position on Syria.
Now, Vijay, Morsi's rhetoric about Syria was very strong. He called it the great human catastrophe of our time.
He said this as well at the non-aligned meeting in Tehran. He said this to the New York Times in an interview. He said this also on Egyptian state television. So this has been the position of Morsi and his government. Very strong criticism of Syria. In fact, the numbers that we have now of just the dead are somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 dead in the space of 18 months. So he's not off when he calls it a major catastrophe of our times. But he's also gone ahead of his rhetoric, because by inviting Iran to join his contact group, and Iran being basically still on the side of the Assad regime, by inviting Iran, he suggested that even though he has a strong position on Syria, he's still willing to have dialogue towards a potential solution that will stop the bloodshed there. And he made that a centerpiece of his speech at the UN.
Egypt, along with the three other countries involved in our initiative, has held meetings that have shown that there are many areas of commonalities. We will continue to work to put an end to the suffering of the Syrian people and provide them with an opportunity to choose freely the regime that best represents them.
يختار بإرادته الحرة بعد أن ينتهي هذا النظام.
After this regime, the current regime, comes to an end, the regime that kills its people day and night, after this regime comes to an end, the Syrian people will choose with their own free will a regime that represents it and places Syria in its right place among democratic countries, so that it can continue to contribute to its Arab common march and its regional and international role based on solid, legitimate foundations.
And finally, in Mr. Morsi's speech, he mentioned the importance of a kind of new cultural compact. In other words, yes, he agreed with President Obama, whose speech, by the way, was largely for the domestic American audience. It was more convincing inside the United States than for the rest of the world. But nonetheless, President Morsi agreed with President Obama that yes, freedom of speech is important, but he said that we have to also have a kind of compact where there's some sense of where it's inappropriate to directly criticize people's religious beliefs, etc. That was the kind of position he took on the film Innocence of Muslims and the protest in its aftermath. And that's a very interesting position he took, because he didn't disregard the question of freedom of speech. He said the Egyptian revolution was about having freedom, was about having liberty, but this should not come, without any understanding of responsibility. And by the way, they very quickly picked up, the Egyptian mission was very quick to say that in France, where there's a great championing of freedom of speech, they still didn't allow people to come and demonstrate against this video, meaning certain kinds of freedoms were going to be restricted. So they said, let's not take a holier than thou position on freedom of speech. Let's understand what freedom of speech means and how everybody abides by that principle.
In terms of Morsi's role, I mean, how much of this then is also just rhetoric and positioning for Morsi? And he's about to make a $1 billion deal with the U.S. in terms of debt relief and other forms of aid, which has been described in the American press as essentially him agreeing to stay within the American foreign policy orbit. That's a quote, I think, from the Wall Street Journal or one of those publications. And so on the one side, he's really fully in bed, it seems, with the Egyptian-American alliance, but he's changing some of the rhetoric. And is that just positioning for his own public opinion within Egypt and within the Arab world?
That could be. It's possible that this is also slightly directed to his own public. On the other hand, if you go back and look at the New York Times interview he did, there was no suggestion in that interview that there's going to be a precipitous break with the old US-Egypt relationship. But what he said there was going to be is a change in emphasis. That means that there is going to be a gradual shift away from Egyptian subservience to the US State Department line. And I think that's basically how he positioned himself at the UN. There was no grand declaration, there was no Hugo Chavez style total break with the US, but there was definitely a lot of daylight between the American position and what is emergent as a new Egyptian position. It's very important what you say about the lack of any kind of discussion about the IMF, about the kind of economic policies that are around the world. The UN General Assembly about 50 years ago, that is in its first 10 to 15 years, at the opening meetings, the speeches were preoccupied with questions of war on the one side, or rather nuclear confrontation, and economic development. The issue of the North-South dialogue was very much at the forefront of the United Nations. In the last 20 years, the question of the North-South dialogue, the question of so-called development of the IMF policies around the world, these have largely disappeared from the main speeches that are given at the UN. And it tells you a lot about the UN's work, that it essentially has narrowed to a preoccupation with security and with so-called counterterrorism.
Now, just going back to the Syria question, the region seems to be all over the place in terms of their positions on Syria. I mean, Saudi Arabia is clearly arming the opposition. Qatar has called for an Arab force armed intervention. Egypt clearly, Morsi, while he's very critical of Assad and wants and calls it this outrageous violation of human rights and such, he's also against intervention, which he's opposed to certainly the Qatari and maybe Saudi position. The Turks are somewhere else. I mean, and of course the Iraqis are kind of more siding with Iran on this.
I mean, the issue is that if you looked at the question of Syria and the region and asked, each of the regimes that surround Syria, are you in favor of Assad or against Assad? That, they will tell you, is the wrong question. The most important question is that what are they capable of? What do they fear? If there's a continuation of this very, very bloody war inside Syria. I mean, Turkey at the initial point went far ahead of what its military was interested in. The Turkish government of Erdogan basically called for the ouster of Bashar al-Assad. The problem is that they didn't calculate sufficiently that there may be a call for the Balkanization of Syria, and if there's a Kurdish autonomous region in northern Syria, this puts incredible pressure on Turkey to once again revisit the Kurdish question inside Turkey. And in fact, over the last 3 weeks, there's been an increased upsurge in Turkish Kurdistan, and the military has been tied down there. As well in Turkey, the military has just had to face another embarrassment last week. Several senior military figures were convicted in a coup attempt. So in Turkey now, there's less of an enthusiasm for their earlier position. The Qataris play a long game in terms of what they say. They have been saying for a long time there needs to be an Arab intervention. The question is, who is going to intervene? It's one thing to make rhetorical statements. It's another to actually understand your capability. The Qataris themselves cannot intervene in Syria. They simply do not have enough of a land army. They have special forces, they have aircraft. The Saudis are not interested. It appears from what I have learned from my sources that when Morsi first floated the idea of the Syria contact group in the OIC meeting in Mecca, the Saudis cut a deal with the Iranians. The Saudis said to the Iranians, if you back off from the, helping or giving maybe support to the demonstrations in eastern Saudi Arabia, we will back off from our support in Syria. And that is the reason why Morsi in an interview said the Saudis were not at all exasperated to have the Iranians at the table in the Syria contact group. So each of the regional forces has their own limitations here. And I think now, they've come to an understanding that previously they had gone ahead of their own abilities to act in Syria. And I think now there's a kind of a middle position emerging. I think this gives some space for this Syria contact group if it can go forward, if people are resolute, if they are able to put sufficient pressure on Damascus, something may come out of that. And I think that's the only hope for Syria at the present point.
All right, thanks very much for joining us, Vijay.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.